All right, welcome everybody to Leninism 101, Workers' Power in Practice. This is a class put on by the People's Education Program, which is a collaboration between All Power Books, Midnight Books, and some individuals. And we're actually going to start off with a group activity, small group activity. I'm not going to ask you to leave your seats though. Maybe get into groups of about 3 or 4. Just kind of turn toward whoever's next to you. If you want to use this area over here, you can do that as well. And I want to get a sense of what everyone already thinks about what Leninism means. So, what do you think Lenin did that advanced the philosophy of Marxism? And in other words, why do Marxists sometimes call themselves Leninists rather than just Marxists? All right, so that's the question. And we'll take about 15 minutes. So just, meet your neighbors and start talking about this question. We'll get some answers from each group afterward. And if you're watching on stream at home, if you're watching with anybody, talk to each other. Streaming on YouTube. So the stream is on allpowerbooks.org. So I think we'll take a couple more minutes and then hoping to hear back from each group afterward. All right, we're going to start wrapping it up. And we have 7 groups, so we're going to try to get to each one if possible. And Savannah's going to go around with a microphone, and hopefully each group can have one person say some of the highlights from your conversations.
Test, test. You guys have a delegate who wants to speak. Group 1. All right, Group 1.
Really? Hello, everyone. My name is Mason. So what we discussed, because we're all new to this as well, but we just sort of talked about, or because the question was, what do you think Lenin did that advanced the philosophy of Marxism? And why do people often call themselves Leninists rather than Marxists? And to be honest, I've never really heard of someone who calls themselves a Leninist but not a Marxist, but like what we sort of described as sort of like the characteristic of like all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. Because like if you say Leninist, maybe it just like assumes you're a Marxist, since like he took a lot of like Marxism and was the first to sort of apply it into a real world practice, and or like one of like the like largest scales at the time of real world practice, and was also the first to apply sort of Marxist or Marxist ideology to contextualize the imperialist world, since Marxism was in the mid-19th century, and since then like the US or like the West, like through its scramble of Africa and like the carving up of Asia as well, there were a lot of sort of like developments for how like high stage finance capital sort of like manifested itself into imperialism. So he was the first to sort of like draw a Marxist analysis of imperialism, and he was also sort of advanced Marxism into like real concrete terms, whereas like Marx thought that the revolution would come through the proletariat after a capitalist society was able to sort of like advance the modes of production high enough to where they would flip, where the proletariat would take means of a high level of production, whereas the USSR, or where the Tsarist Russia was very backwards at the time in terms it was largely an agrarian society that got absolutely decimated in World War I, and the population was just very, very small at the time. So he sort of drawn how to like garner support and how like the peasantry was going to undergo this revolution in like as Marx predicted would be the proletariat. Boom.
Very good.
Yeah. And that's the class.
Yeah, I know.
All right, Group 2.
Well, hang on. I want to like summarize. So yeah, great. He was the first to kind of lead a really advanced proletarian revolution that actually took power, and he applied Marxist theory to new situations that were developing, like imperialism. Yeah, very good. You want to decide which one is Group 2?
Hi, I'm Neil also came to the same conclusions that Leninism is one of the first successful executions of Marxism, and its application to at what Russia was at the time. And our discussion just went on to like how uh, our own philosophies and like what we call ourselves, and how it's so diverse what Marxism is, because like Leninism didn't take hold in China. It was Maoism. Neither did it in Korea or Vietnam or Cuba, for example. It did inspire, but you know, like what Marxism is like a growing philosophy that won't apply the same in other places. Like, if it didn't happen in 1917 Russia, but it happened in 1920 Russia, it could have been something called something else after some other guy, you know, because the conditions and everything would have been different, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that raises a good question, right? So, you know, is Leninism just the specificity of what Lenin did in Russia, and then we have to look at other specific situations in other countries that had revolutions? Or is there something in Leninism that is kind of more universally applicable? I think that's a good question. Yeah, next group.
Were you guys a group? Oh, yeah. Okay, who wants to speak?
Hi, my name is 10, like the number 10. Um, so I guess we kind of just explored what Marxism is, which is a science. Um, and he's a social scientist, and basically ultimately decided that you would need to have a vanguard party in order to be able to carry the masses into like a revolution. Otherwise, if you just have strikes and stuff like that, it just never, people get pacified when their demands are met. And so you actually need a vanguard party. And so Lenin was the one who practiced that, like made the vanguard party and then carried that out. I don't know, I'm not sure about that, all that. These are things that this is my impression. And that basically if you're a Leninist, then you would not, basically you believe that you can only achieve revolution through violent means and by like having a vanguard party. So you can't just skip to communism without having to seize power through like military revolution. And so Marxism is like the science and Leninism is the practice.
Yeah, good. So the vanguard party and the question of revolutionary violence, yeah.
Were you guys a group? Has anyone decided they want to speak?
Oh boy. Hey.
You don't have to give a lecture or anything, just the brief highlights would be appreciated, yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm more of like the explain it like I'm five kind of crowd. So I think we were in agreement that Marxist was the scientist behind it, and Lenin put it into practice. Some of us were here to then get a refresher on how Lenin got into power and where we stand now today, and how it correlates to where we are and how we got here. So I think that might be where we stand, kind of. Okay, great. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you.
All right, group.
Hey everyone, I'm Jose. My group basically talked about Lenin as far as like advancing Marxism into like a practice. That was like the simplest version that we kind of came down to. And the analysis of like the state and the role of the state, as well as the difference between like a Marxist and, you know, a Leninist, someone calling themselves that, is like Marxists a lot of the time are very like theoretical and kind of academic in a lot of terms, or in the sense of that, and Leninists are about that action. Yeah, that's the best way I could put it.
Good stuff, thank you. Do we have 2 more groups, I think?
Yeah.
Okay.
Who wants to speak for this group?
All right, so really briefly, we were just saying, I mean, I think Leninism ultimately, the reason why people gravitate to it is because early practitioner of like an actual successful revolution, right? And so out of that comes the desire to understand that revolution and figure out if there are principles and lessons that we can apply just in the same way that Lenin applied a certain kind of Marxism. If there's a certain kind of Marxism that the experience of Lenin, the experience of the Bolsheviks, grouped together in what we could call Leninism as like a series of like concepts or principles that could help us apply it to our practice. And people mention different things, principles of organization, principles of analysis for like social conditions that are sensitive to things like imperialism, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, good, good. Thank you. Yes, we have the theory of the state. We have, you know, principles of organization and theoretical application to social conjunctures. Yeah, last group in the back, and then we'll go forward.
Hi, I'm Matthew. We talked about a few things, one of them being that Leninism is the theory of the proletarian revolution in the epoch of imperialism, and that's what separates it from Marxism or Marx's era in particular. Also the idea of the party of a new type that Lenin developed, whether it be a vanguard party or featuring democratic centralism, and also advancing things like the national question and centralizing it in the revolutionary discussion, including things like the peasantry and the dictatorship of the proletariat, including nationally oppressed groups as well in that equation. That's sort of the advancements by Lenin.
Thank you. Excellent, excellent from every group. Really appreciate that. Yeah, heard a lot of really good stuff. I think importantly, people are hitting my, maybe I'll use one that you guys just used. Sweet, thank you. Yeah, can everyone hear me all right? Okay, great. So yeah, what we're hearing is that there are some kind of consistent themes that are coming up, right? This idea of the party, you know, theory of imperialism, a successful revolution in concrete practice, and let me go to this. Yeah, I think I can barely see my slides over there. And we're going to get into some of what I think are the dominant interpretations of Lenin today that are really alive in the Marxist movement. But in the meantime, I actually want to start with a recap of what we learned from Marxism 101 and 102, right? Because Lenin was a Marxist. That's basically the most uncontroversial thing you could say about Lenin. And our resident Marxist scholar over here taught 2 classes on Marxism. I think we're going to be having some more of these coming up soon. And I want to distill Marxism down to 2 core principles to make it as simple as possible. What is Marxism? And I think these principles come down to, first, the Marxist theory of political economy, which I'm going to distill as meaning the centrality of the mode of production in determining the character of all social relations in society, which under capitalism takes shape as the irreconcilable antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. I'll come back to that quote in a second. And I think there is a great kind of poetic way of saying this that Marx himself put in his book, Foundations of a Critique of Political Economy, or the Grundrisse. So in all forms of society, there is one specific kind of production which predominates over the rest, whose relations thus assign rank and influence to the others. It is a general illumination which bathes all the other colors and modifies their particularity. It is a particular ether which determines the specific gravity of every being which has materialized within it. So it is the particular that changes all other particulars in society. and thus establishes itself as a universal form of social relation as we know it under capitalism. It establishes a common language of transactionality, I think, is the way that we experience capitalism's influence over society. It normalizes capital accumulation as the mediation that kind of binds us together into a society. Now, why is the mode of production so important? Well, it's how we reproduce society, reproduce ourselves. It's how we live. It's how we survive. The mode of production is central to any society in any epoch. The mode of production, yes, takes shape in different eras of history. And right now, the mode of production is this irreconcilable antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat from the Marxist perspective. Another way of saying this, right, we've said that the capital-labor relation colors all the other social relations in society. Another way of saying that is we currently live under a dictatorship of capital. And we're going to talk about what we mean by dictatorship later in this class. Okay, so that's the first principle, Marxist political economy. The second principle of Marxism is the negation of capitalism by the dictatorship of the proletariat. I think a more accurate way of saying that would be the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. And Lenin has an excellent quote from his book State and Revolution, where he says, "It is often said and written that the main point in Marxist theory is the class struggle, but this is wrong. And this wrong notion very often results in an opportunist distortion of Marxism and its falsification in a spirit acceptable to the bourgeoisie. For the theory of the class struggle was created not by Marx, but by the bourgeoisie before Marx, and generally speaking, it is acceptable to the bourgeoisie. Those who recognize only the class struggle are not yet Marxists. They may be found to still be within the bounds of bourgeois thinking and bourgeois politics. To confine Marxism to the theory of the class struggle means curtailing Marxism, distorting it, reducing it to something acceptable to the bourgeoisie. Only he is a Marxist who extends the recognition of the class struggle to the recognition of the dictatorship of the proletariat." So very certain terms being used here. Class struggle is not enough of a perspective in order to understand Marxism. You have to also accept the dictatorship of the proletariat. So the project of Marxism is essentially the construction of the dictatorship of the proletariat, a process that we can refer to as socialism. So admitting these two core principles is necessary if we want to call ourselves Marxists. But the question we began with is, what does it also mean to call ourselves Leninists? What did Lenin add to this framework? And for me, there are four interpretations of Leninism that we need to go over and understand, to understand basically where Leninism is at today. And the first interpretation is the Cold War caricature of Lenin. Common arguments that come from this perspective is that Lenin was an opportunist just seeking, personal political power. He didn't trust the working class to liberate itself. He substituted a vanguard party for the organic mass movement. And you see this kind of perspective not just among right-wing people and liberals. You see this coming from people like Noam Chomsky, unfortunately. It spans the left and right portions of the political spectrum. So on the left, you get the super reactionary, like in the right wing, for example, you get super reactionary anti-Soviet Union propaganda. You see that everywhere. But from the left, you get different kinds of critiques of Lenin that are either overt or covert. And you see these in things like post-Marxism. This is a reaction to what is perceived as the bureaucratized Soviet Union, right? Using terms like counter-hegemony instead of the dictatorship of the proletariat, suggesting that the alternative to bourgeois rule is no social order at all, but a universe of autonomously self-defining individuals, right? We don't want to commit to just a working class political project. We want to create sort of this diffuse resistance movement. Some scholars like Hart and Negri use terms like the multitude instead of the revolutionary working class, creating an agency beyond empire instead of what we're trying to do in Marxism, right, which is build working class power. Efforts to identify the working class as just one among many oppressed groups, I think, fall into this tendency. And again, if we're Marxists, we think, yes, there is oppression everywhere, but the central contradiction under capitalism colors every form of social relation, including all the forms of oppression. So the centrality of that capital-labor antagonism is lost in these anti-Leninist perspectives. One good quote from Lenin about syndicalism, which is kind of a form of anarchism, I don't want to go too much into what exactly it means, but syndicalism either repudiates the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat or else relegates it, as it does political power in general, to a back seat. We, however, put it in the forefront. So even the question of political power is not articulated very clearly, in very clear terms, in this Cold War caricature of Lenin that we see on the left. Another term you get in this genre of Leninist critiques is cultural hegemony. And I have actually used terms like counter-hegemony and cultural hegemony. I don't anymore, because I see that the context for these terms is in this post-Marxist discourse. And cultural hegemony is a way of retreating from the project of proletarian hegemony. And actually, one of the authors that I lean on heavily in this course is Alan Shandro, who wrote this book here, Lenin and the Logic of Hegemony. I think we have a few copies for sale. I highly recommend people read it. Shandro has a quote where he says, Gramsci is often the one we associate with this cultural hegemony term. Gramsci was a Leninist. Gramsci never used the term cultural hegemony. I'm not sure where that came from, but it's awful. Okay, I think that's a pretty good Leninist critique of this post-Marxist idea of cultural hegemony. That's a good question. Maybe, you know, his idea of waging a war of position is often used as a way of creating this distortion of cultural hegemony, even though he never uses the term. Kind of the long-term buildup of hegemony will have to include some cultural project. But the way that this term is employed is very much an antithesis to the political project of working class hegemony over the state. Hopefully someone will teach a Gramsci 101. I would learn a lot from that class myself. Okay, the second perspective I'm going to call Lenin as organizer. And this is the perspective that many of the groups spoke to, which is the key contribution of Lenin is the organizational structure of the Bolshevik Party. In other words, Lenin developed Marxism by concretizing the organizational strategy of the Communist Party, whose responsibility it is to put Marxism into praxis. The success of the October Revolution in Russia in 1917, the perceived strict discipline of the Bolshevik Party, and the programmatic strength of the Third International, led by the Soviet Union, at least the first few congresses, before socialism in one country was introduced, another topic. The strength of this international revolutionary movement that came out of the Bolshevik Party's success in Russia inspires this interpretation of Lenin. We just need to look at his organizational strategies and apply those to our context. And I think this is the Lenin that is the most operative in the organized Marxist groups today. And there's a lot of truth to this interpretation. The third interpretation is Lenin as Marxist. And the basic idea of this is that Lenin was just a Marxist, guys. He applied Marxism to his concrete conditions in Russia, but first and foremost, He was just a follower of the largest Marxist formation at the time, which was the Second International, which lasted from about 1890 to 1914. And its biggest section was in Germany, the largest communist party in the world. And he was basically inspired by this existing Marxist perspective, Marxist organization, and all of the organizational stuff that, you know, people lean on is just a reflection of Lenin organizing a party under conditions of like secret police in Russia. And that we make too much of that, and we should just see Lenin as a Marxist who fought a revolution based on Marx's ideas. Now, you know, I think the book that really puts this perspective forward is Lars Lee's book, Lenin Rediscovered, in 2008. And that has gained some traction recently. And there's a lot to be gained from that perspective too. But the perspective I'm going to be speaking from today is a different perspective. And I'm going to call this perspective Lenin as the thinker of the strategic logic of hegemony. And I'm taking this term, I'm changing it a little bit. Alan Shandro in this book uses the term the politico-strategic logic of the struggle for hegemony. And I'm going to shorten that to the strategic logic of hegemony to make sure we're, you know, staying sane. I think it's a ridiculous long term. It's very thorough, but maybe not the one that's most practical. And so in this book, this perspective is put forward. I've also seen it put forward in Sean Mitchell's essay, Lenin, Elections, and Socialist Hegemony. And these works present a Lenin that isn't captured in the predominant interpretations and characterizations that I just described. This perspective is one that I'm basically going to be speaking from for the rest of the class, and we'll go into it more as we go through. But I want to first kind of define what we mean by hegemony. I've used this term a few times. It's a loaded term. The simplest way of defining hegemony is as power or influence. I think a more accurate way of defining it would be decisive political leverage. That is, I think there's a connotation of this too, that's kind of operating in the background or woven into the fabric of society. We don't even notice it usually, but it is consolidated power, right? And I have an example of hegemony that I want to run by you. How many of you see these billboards constantly every day and never talk about them? Like you see this on your commute, you see it outside your house, and you're just like, oh yeah, that's always been there. That's normal, that's Sweet James, he's an injury attorney. Who am I to decide what my neighborhood looks like, right? You know, what say do I have in these fucking ugly ass things going up all over my city that tell you to sue your fucking neighbor for getting in a fender bender or whatever, let alone critiquing our transportation system that leads to this kind of stuff. This is consolidated power. The fact that we don't even question this ugly ass aesthetic. Oh yeah, that's Sweet James, he's got graphic artists, they made that design, you know. It'll be up there for a few more months, and then it'll be Morgan & Morgan or Jacoby & Myers. This is normalized power. This is hegemony. So basically for this class, I'm going to leave that up for as long as I can. If you operate from one of the perspectives I just described, in the way you think about Lenin, basically I'm going to ask you to challenge that perspective as much as possible today. As I talk about this Lenin of the strategic logic of hegemony. And the way that I'm going to try to illustrate what this perspective means is by going through some key issues, some key concepts in Leninism that he dealt with in his revolutionary practice. And the first of these is spontaneity versus consciousness. This is a crucial concept. And actually, as we go through these, sometimes I will contrast the Bolshevik perspective with the Menshevik perspective, and I am going to be simplifying a lot. I'm going to be compressing a lot into those perspectives. Different revolutionaries, different Marxists at different times. We're operating from a Menshevik logic, or we're operating from Bolshevik logic, and sometimes they switched. But, yeah, I will, thank you, yeah. These were two factions within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the Menshevik fraction and the Bolshevik fraction. They collaborated a lot, but they had distinct ideas about how a revolution should be fought. And I think there is a consistent and distinct perspective that we can associate with Menshevism and with Bolshevism. So sometimes when we talk about one of these key issues that Lenin confronted, I'm going to tell you what the difference is, I think, between these perspectives. And this is Alan Shandro's approach as well. And I think it's just very helpful. Maybe I could get some volunteers to read these quotes, actually. Maybe someone sitting close to the front. Yeah, please.
First quote, "The working class spontaneously gravitates towards socialism, but the most widespread and continuously and diversely revived bourgeoisie bourgeois ideology spontaneously imposes itself upon the working class to a still greater degree." Want me to read the second one? You can hold out for 3 days, maybe even for 3 months, on the strength of the admixture of sheer resentment contained in the mass of the people. But you won't win a national war, you'll never overthrow the terrible enemy machine, and you won't change human beings if you forget to raise the standard of consciousness of the rank and file.
All right, so what is spontaneity? Spontaneity describes the pattern in which particular class struggles erupt within society, such as worker strikes, protests against police brutality, anti-war movements, shooting the guy that denied your claim. These are all subjected, however, to the influence of the ideological apparatuses of the bourgeoisie and the impact of specific bourgeois ideologists, which impose limitations on the scope of the spontaneous struggle, hampering their development into a struggle for real working class hegemony over the state. So the bourgeoisie has inbuilt customs, right? We talked about hegemony, the naturalized logic of capitalist relations. And there are also active countermeasures taken against spontaneous actions, right? So these two things are operating in tandem to hamper the potential of spontaneous uprisings. And the goal of these interventions is to convince the spontaneous movements that they have common interests that supersede the class antagonism, that the bourgeoisie is the only legitimate political power in society, and that to disturb that would be unrealistic, dangerous, or otherwise inconceivable. So the bourgeoisie does not want you to adopt the two core principles of Marxism, to put it briefly. So spontaneity does have a direction, right? But it's scattershot. And our target is a moving target far downrange. And so a spontaneous struggle is never going to address the actual target that it needs to address, which is consolidated capitalist power, bourgeois society. So our natural inclination to fight against oppression by itself does not arm us with the conceptual and strategic tools required for political struggle against a powerful and adept adversary. There's a lot working against us. I was watching the World Chess Championship, which is still going. I think they're on game 10 out of 14. And on game 6, there was an excellent piece of commentary from one of the grandmasters watching the game, Peter Lecko. And he said that, he made this very Leninist point, I thought. He said that if the logical follow-up is not good enough, then Grandmaster Gukesh, one of the contenders for the championship, needs to find some alternative. First of all, he has to understand that playing naturally leads into some trouble. This is the first step to understanding what else he should do. So the project of socialism then requires a conscious element capable of making strategic determinations in the struggle for working class power. And in that chess game, Gukesh was caught in his opponent's preparation. His opponent already had looked at the position on a computer, probably months ago. And so if he just played the natural moves, the computer that his opponent looked at months ago would already have an answer for all those moves, right? So playing naturally, playing instinctively would not be good enough in that situation. Okay, so the question then is, if spontaneity is not good enough, we need consciousness, but consciousness about what? Consciousness means recognizing the two fundamental claims of Marxism. Can someone tell me what those were again? This is the test you were talking about. Yeah, not bad. So the central, like to put it in more academic terms, the centrality of the capital-labor relation and its irreconcilability, right? The bourgeoisie and proletariat are locked into an irreconcilable struggle. Or that's another way of recognizing the class struggle, like you said. And then, yeah, the dictatorship of the proletariat as the negation of capitalism. But it's worth clarifying Lenin's nuanced understanding of the relationship between these two principles. He adds something important, and this develops the idea of what consciousness is. Lenin does not claim that the workers are unaware of their interests or of the antagonism of their interests to those of their employers. What distinguishes his claim is the extension of this antagonism to the whole modern political and social system. So he's not just saying there's this bourgeois proletarian antagonism. He's saying that this antagonism shows up as bourgeois society itself. And so we have to overthrow bourgeois society. We can't just overthrow our bosses. In other words, this has to be a state struggle. And the importance of this framework is that every instance of resistance, this is really important, every grievance against any facet of bourgeois society, of the social totality, is a potential site for the contestation of bourgeois power. So for Lenin, the socialist movement is not just concerned with the contradiction, right, between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. It's that this is refracted across every layer of society. And the task of the conscious element is to proliferate this kind of consciousness. And the task of the bourgeoisie is to inhibit it. And we've talked about the ways that it can do that. The inertia of capitalist logic. Lenin called this the force of habit, of generations of living under capitalism. And the active intervention of bourgeois strategists. So with this in mind, maybe I can borrow Savannah again for the mic. I want to ask you guys, what are some ways, I think it's the next slide. What are some current examples where we see this sort of influence, this bourgeois influence over spontaneous movements? How does this show up in society? Like, what are some examples of this? I can think of some, but I really want to hear some from y'all. And then maybe I'll give one later, yeah.
I think this is something Mark Fisher talks about a lot with like capitalist realism and the idea that like even when we try to imagine like the future like post-capitalist or like like a like very far future, we still end up kind of imagining a sense of capitalism. So like even when like all the current systems have fallen, we look to a way that is still generally using capitalism. So for example, like WALL-E, like it's like the end times, but everyone is still basically just like living in like a more advanced version of capitalism in which like technology reigns over them and people are removed from their labor and things like that. So
I think something I think of is Black Lives Matter, just like after George Floyd's murder, abolish the police, slowly started trickling into like defund, and that's kind of the rhetoric that bourgeois ideologists, specifically like Democrats, were sort of willing to. Democrats, in conjunction with like all of the like neoliberal institutions that like unions and nonprofits that typically go in the direction that the Democrats go in, it kind of devolved into away from abolition and into reform, which typically is what the I don't know, the popular liberal like I don't know, I feel like a lot of people believe that's like, oh, reform is a lot of people's brains stop at reform. It's like reform is the furthest we can go. So, yeah, that's kind of my
Okay, I guess this isn't so current, but from growing up and seeing how the online, at least the boogeyman being like, oh, the Illuminati, who, to now it's just people straight up going like, I don't like trans people, like openly, and that's a very friendly way of saying it, you know, like just saying how, like at one point, like the ones who controlled the planet were lizard people and Illuminati, and now it's like it's actually trans people behind the scenes and people, Mexicans eating cats and dogs and whatnot. Seeing, yeah, and like because like the internet was harder to access, and now you're just on Twitter and your grandpa's there, like, yeah, I see this, trans people, I agree, you know.
Yeah, I was just gonna say. I mean, I think definitely we see it in Black Lives Matter, but I think in everything, it's like, arguably, well, at least for me, when I hear this, I think about what's so powerful in like bourgeois culture is like the focus and the focus on the individual as opposed to the collective. And so when you see spontaneous movements, there isn't a defined collective, right? And that plays perfectly into it. And so that's why we're able to see like so many images of like people standing out, and it's like this one individual and the focus on that individual, and it fucking destroys obviously any chance for movement. But it plays into this aesthetic, which is what we see so much of, right? There's this constant kind of fetishization of what it means to be a revolutionary or whatever, and so it just commodifies. It commodifies the movement, I guess.
I'm gonna get somebody in the back. I'm sorry.
Thanks. I think what comes to mind when I think about this question is like a control over like airing public grievances, like the role of like permitting ahead of say like mass demonstration or like facing police oppression or like the decorum that is sort of expected at public meetings, or like more broadly like I guess like what you would call like respectability politics, as a form of like controlling spontaneous movements.
Okay, I skipped. Okay, maybe this is me trying to relate my niche interest to this question, but I've lately gone down the hole of researching who Neri Oxman is. She's kind of like a speculative designer, but she's also a Zionist, and she's married to Bill Ackman, also a Zionist, billionaire. And she kind of, on her website, she does speculative design and architecture with her company. They're trying to, oh, this new design uses bees to build a polymer. This is like a really environmental shoe. And so I guess, I don't know if environmentalism is technically a spontaneous movement, but there's definitely, I think, in the broader design and art sphere, which I'm in, a kind of intellectualizing of things that actually matter, and thus removing any power from it.
Yeah, okay, let's get one or two more.
I also work in like urban planning and design, and I think about like these other firms that I want to apply to who are like who are abolitionists, but they're trying to build like restorative justice centers or like community centers, and it's hard because I really struggle with how much do we survive and also take care of people and reform people or like reform things to make things better for people, and versus but then also know that when we get the signal, whenever the signal is, if we're organized, that oh, if it's time to burn shit down, that we can actually burn it down and know that what we're doing is just temporary, like easement for our people basically and taking care of them. So but then you also have to make money. I don't know.
Um, I guess I just wanted to say it's really weird that. Oh, I guess I just wanted to say it's really weird that there's commercials about hate where you have to support Israel. So, just like 20 seconds of like a commercial about you're gonna stop hate by supporting Israel, when everyone's just smiling, acting like it's about mental health, when there's nothing they're gonna actually talk about. It's just supporting a state that doesn't really give a fuck.
Keep it short. Yeah, I would say that censorship and like organizing on social media itself, with like shadow banning and censorship, they basically determine what gets uplift, what looks spontaneous and what isn't allowed to be spontaneous, i.e. the censoring of like communist organizations specifically, and other organizations and stuff that are a legitimate threat to those in power. So, yeah.
Yeah, some really good answers there. And I want to even point out, you brought up the George Floyd rebellion. We didn't even get reforms, right? We stopped before reforms. Yeah. And this gets to, someone brought up Mark Fisher, this sort of pre-corporation of the spontaneous struggle back into the fold of capitalism. We don't even expect reforms, right? And I think it even relates to what you said about these pro-Israel ads. They tell you some moral story. You know you have no power to change the world, so they just try to associate what you think of as morally correct ideas with what's already happening. And that's supposed to be our outlet, the way that political grievances are articulated. So we're up against a powerful process that's constantly deployed against our movements. We should keep in mind, though, that the efficacy of bourgeois cooptation can only ever be partial. And the reason for this is that bourgeois ideology cannot fully capture proletarian experience. In other words, and I'm going to take this quote from a psychoanalyst that I like a lot, Todd McGowan. Bourgeois ideology can explain society's contradictions, but it cannot lessen their pain, right? So the contradictions still cause anxieties. They still cause suffering. And no matter how much explanation our enemies use to try to make us forget about those things, we are constantly reminded of those things. And so there's constantly this cycle of spontaneous uprisings and strategic putting down of those uprisings. Okay. And we've talked about what consciousness means, but where does consciousness come from? And this is one of the things that the Cold War caricature of Lenin kind of actually has a point, in a way. Consciousness has to come from theory. These Marxist core principles can only be grasped theoretically at first, right? And Marx was a bourgeois, petty bourgeois academic, certainly Engels was, Lenin was. They came from the academy. So these ideas didn't emerge spontaneously. These ideas have to be introduced to the movements from without. This is a big controversial term within Leninism, this idea of consciousness from without. And Lenin's answer to this problem of introducing consciousness to the mass movement is the vanguard, right? So just as the bourgeoisie has its strategists, leaders, spokespeople, and politicians, so must the working class. So for Lenin, someone has to take responsibility for this strategic logic of hegemony in the face of inevitable counter-revolution. So we are locked into a strategic struggle with the bourgeoisie. Whether or not we confront that, that's the fact. That's the reality. And the conscious element has to take responsibility for this strategic dynamic. Now, who today is acting in this responsible role in terms of combating the hegemony of capital over our movements? You know, we don't really have such an element that has the power to really counteract these forms of hegemony. Can we honestly say, for example, that proletarian hegemony is consolidating itself at each spontaneous juncture? Or is it only the bourgeoisie that's consolidating itself? I think, unfortunately, I would lean towards the latter being the case, which means that the conscious element right now in the United States has not really lived up to its task. Now this distinction, again, I just want to clarify this between the masses, the mass movement, the spontaneous movement, and the conscious element. So, you know, you might say, well, there's this intelligentsia that needs to lead the workers. Well, that's not necessarily the case. And this is a quote from Alan Chandro: "To the extent that workers assimilate Marxist theory, they are considered part of the conscious vanguard." To the extent that workers assimilate Marxist theory, they are considered part of the conscious vanguard, and while still part of the working class, are distinguished from the spontaneous movement. So when you arrive at the core premises of Marxism, you are part of the vanguard now. Doesn't matter what your class origin was. Now it's your problem. You don't get to disguise yourself as just one of the masses anymore. Now you have to take responsibility for what you know. And that puts you into this other category of the conscious element or the vanguard. Now, how can the masses come to consciousness? That's a separate question. And this question is one of the examples where Menshevism and Bolshevism have a different answer to this problem. It looks like I forgot to go through some slides here. I do like this Franz Fanon quote. Maybe somebody can read this for us. You want to read it?
All this taking stock of the situation, this enlightening of consciousness, and this advance of the knowledge of histories of societies are only possible within the framework of an organization. Franz Fanon.
Awesome, thank you. Franz Fanon was a Leninist, by the way. There's a chapter in his book, Wretched of the Earth, that is called Spontaneity, Its Strength and Weakness, and it's an absolute, you know, dedication to Lenin's conception of those same terms. Okay, so how is consciousness developed? And Lenin himself has a couple good quotes here. Only struggle educates the exploited class. Only struggle discloses to it the magnitude of its own power, widens its horizon, enhances its abilities, clarifies its mind, and forges its will. Another quote. Revolution is impossible without a change in the views of the majority of the working class, a change brought about by the political experience of the masses, never by propaganda alone. So while consciousness must originate theoretically from outside the spontaneous movement, it requires putting it into practice in a mass political way in order for the masses to come to consciousness. So for example, I'm a Marxist. I believe in the two core principles of Marxism that I just talked about. And I will try to persuade you about the legitimacy of those principles as powerful ways of perceiving the world and changing it. But you don't have to believe me, and most people will not believe me. Not yet. the purely theoretical understanding of the class antagonism will speak to some of us who are nerds, right? You know, hopefully the people in this room can be persuaded of these arguments, but this will not be everyone. And Lenin has an excellent quote here, which is a critique of taking this purely kind of educational, patronizing pedagogical path that some in the Marxist movement take. He says, "Only a few bad intellectuals believe that it is enough for workers to be told a few things about factory conditions and to have repeated to them over and over again what has long been known." Which he's, you know, what he's getting at there is that people have a general sense that their conditions are not good and that they have bosses that are exploiting them and landlords that are extorting them, right? Among many, many other complaints that people have about the way that oppression works in society. But if we accept that convincing alone is not going to, you know, reach the masses of people, then our task is not just to educate, but to initiate and lead political struggles that expose the primacy of the class contradiction, that expose it in a way for all to see. I mean, how many of us got an education participating in mass protests like the George Floyd Rebellion or the protests for Gaza? It puts, you know, even though we needed more consciousness than we were getting from these things because there wasn't really a political leadership articulating the movements, it puts antagonism right in your face, right, to participate in a mass way in political struggles. But this is not the way that the Menshevik conception of consciousness development works. The Menshevik conception, and again, this is a characterization of a particular line of thinking that doesn't necessarily always get associated with the same people over time. But there was this idea that we can just educate people enough in the meantime for the forces of production. Someone over here talked about how capitalism reaches a point where things flip, ultimately, where the crises are just too strong, right? And society will have to turn upside down. It'll just be too obvious what needs to happen. So the logic of Menshevism leads to the dominance of the proletariat, but only at the threshold of socialism. So socialism is this thing that's coming down the pipeline, right? And we just need to prepare people. We need to educate people, prepare people. You know, sure, go to protests, you know, wage electoral campaigns, and just get our message out there. But really, we're waiting for this big revolution that's coming down the road. I think that's the perspective that Lenin was at odds with, that he was in conflict with. And I want to put this another way. So a friend of mine once laid out this formulation that I think is really good. That there is on the one hand what must be done, and then there is what can be done. And these two things are never the same. Thankfully, I mean, life would be very boring, right? If those two things were always the same, there'd be nothing to do. There's what must be done and there is what can be done. Now, for Menshevism, the link between these two things is largely a historically driven process, pointing toward this eventual socialist revolution. But for Bolshevism and for Lenin, the link involves a much more dynamic process involving subjective actions that actively transform the material conditions to bring the movement to a desirable future state. So this subjective attempt to bridge what can be done with what must be done is what Lenin meant by the phrase, "what is to be done." This is an act. This is an act of political will. This is a subjective intervention into a political landscape that changes the landscape itself, that changes the conditions in a way that favors the project of working class power. And so when we attempt to bridge these two things, what can be done with what must be done, we are now engaged in this dynamic political struggle that requires an understanding and an appreciation for the strategic logic of hegemony. When we change conditions, we create a new set of conditions that have their own problems that Marx can't teach us about necessarily. That we, as Marxists acting in political struggles have to come up with new answers to. And the bourgeoisie will have a response to those things. And then we will have a response, and the landscape changes again. So this is a dynamic struggle, right? It's not good enough to just organize our own socialist clubs, you know, bowling leagues, speakeasies. We don't even have these things, really. We're not, Menshevism would be great if everyone believed that, you know, we need to build up these mass working class institutions that sort of consolidate its identity until the revolution. That would be a big step forward from where we're at now. But even that for Lenin is not enough. And I have another quote that I think captures his problem with this idea of what it means to fight a revolution. Does someone want to read this one for us? Anyone? Yeah, thank you.
In the political doldrums that followed the 1905 revolution, Menshevik activists, absorbed in the odorous daily struggle to organize trade unions, cooperative societies, and other legal expressions of working class self-activity, relegated the political struggle for hegemony to the background. These forms of self-activity could not be situated in the relation to the strategic projects of adversaries. The Mensheviks were consequently obliged to subordinate themselves to circumstances created by others.
Thank you. So we can see this distinction, right? And we're also getting a sense of what Lenin means by political struggle to raise consciousness among the masses. It is not just organizing our own institutions. It is engaging in a state struggle against adversaries that will have a complex response to our interventions. This is what really exposes that class antagonism to the masses. And this is really, I mean, the key piece of this for me. For Lenin, the way that the proletariat consolidates its position in the course of each particular struggle is the revolution. That is socialism. Socialism is navigating the complications of the political struggle, the strategic struggle against the bourgeoisie. There is no socialism up ahead beyond this constant intervention and dynamic interface between these two political forces. History for Bolshevism, then, doesn't just move forward or backward. We are not just preparing our forces for the inevitable class war. History is moving forward. Okay, history is always moving forward. The question is, which path will history take? The struggle over which path is taken is the struggle for socialism. Are we going to take a capitalist path, or are we going to take a proletarian path? Are we going to fight for hegemony, for proletarian hegemony over the movements that actually exist? Now, I went on Reddit for part of my research for this class. There's some good stuff on there. But I found this quote that I think basically captures a perspective that's dominant among Leninists in the United States today. This is a member of an organization I respect a lot. They're active back in my hometown, Seattle. They've done some really good stuff. But I think that this orientation is not a Leninist orientation. Let's put it that way. So, as a vanguard, he's trying to explain what the vanguard means to this Reddit audience. As a vanguard, we maintain the spark of a strong Marxist analysis and program so that we have cadres that are confident to share this with the working class when a revolutionary situation develops. So how do you think Lenin would critique this statement? Yeah, can I get the mic runner again? Thank you.
Lenin would call it like spontaneous or glorifying spontaneity, because the idea of share this with the working class when a revolutionary situation develops, Lenin would say that the vanguard has to make the revolutionary situation.
I mean, that was a good answer. Does this speak to a certain perspective, though, right? I mean, we all know what this perspective is. And I think all of us at one point have even believed in this perspective. But it's not a Leninist perspective. Damn, I was hoping more people would jump in. Okay, here we go. Thank you. One more at least. All right.
Well, I think Lenin would say that it's the working class itself, people from the working class, who are the leaders who develop this ideology. It's not like somebody brings it to them from outside, which is implied by that quote.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I think it's a little more complicated than just the working class will come to its own conclusions in a revolutionary situation. I think the intervention at the site of struggle itself. Again, I really want to put this forward as the notion of the Leninist idea of the revolution is intervention at the site of struggle itself is the process of revolution. And that is where consciousness is raised for Lenin. So this idea of the revolutionary situation down the road is a wrong notion from Lenin's perspective. And we're going to get to some concrete examples where Lenin, puts his money where his mouth is on this question. Now, people have brought up the party. We've only really talked about the role of the vanguard, but I want to address the party itself briefly. I wanted Reddit to redeem itself, so I got another quote from a Reddit user that I like. The Vanguard Party is not the embryo of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It is merely a tool used to bring about the dictatorship of the proletariat. The Vanguard concerns itself with the interests of a class, not a party. And parties are moments in the development of classes. I think these are all, these can be taken in a number of ways, but I think these are all more or less Leninist conceptions of the party. One of the mistakes that I think Leninists make today is to see the organizational forms that the Bolsheviks took, namely a highly centralized and sometimes clandestine party. Remember, we were dealing with the Tsarist secret police at that time in Russia, as universally applicable to all conditions. I think a better way to think about the party is that the party itself is part of the terrain of the strategic logic of struggle and not separate from it. So the forms that the vanguard organization might take should always be considered as part of the objective conditions of the hegemonic struggle. So it's not like we can just grab this party concept that was developed by Lenin and okay, that's now the party, and then maybe we can grab this People's Army idea from Mao and then put that into our struggle. No. Every conjuncture requires this same assessment, this strategic assessment, requires a new assessment with the core principles in mind, right? We have an axiom, we need to build workers' power, but how you do that is a strategic question always, and that includes the question of how to organize a party. In one of his letters, and I think this is a very good way of contrasting the vanguard with the party, Marx made the distinction between the ephemeral party and the broad historical party. So the ephemeral party is the form, the concrete form that the party takes at any given political situation. But the broad historical party is the idea of the party itself, is the function of the party theoretically that is always there, that always demands attention and adherence to, regardless of what the actual parties on the ground look like. And he was using this as his excuse for not being in a party for like 8 years straight. But I think it's still a good way of laying this out. So for this class and for Marxists, I think we first have to understand the second sense of the party, this broad historical party. The role of the vanguard, in other words. This is a theoretical role. And the party is a practical matter to be determined based on a shared acceptance by the class-conscious element that a vanguard must take some ephemeral form in the current political conjuncture. It's also a myth that the Bolshevik Party was this tight-knit, you know, well-organized, 100% disciplined unit of revolutionaries. Many moments in the year 1917 alone will tell you that this is not the case. Lenin himself violated the dictates of the Bolshevik Central Committee and came into Petrograd when he was a wanted man. Right? The Central Committee didn't want him to get arrested again. But he put on this wig and showed up at a Central Committee meeting and made an argument that they needed to do an insurrection. This was on October 10th. And I think he was wrong in that argument he made. I think it was too early for an insurrection. And they ignored him. I mean, they said they agreed with him because he's a really persuasive guy. But the majority of people in the soldiers' soviets, or councils of soldiers, that had their own autonomous organizing units, didn't think they were ready. They weren't militarily organized enough. They didn't think they had enough support from soldiers on the front lines during World War I, Russian soldiers. And so Lenin basically didn't get his way. Even though the Central Committee voted for his position, they also, in practice, with their feet, did not enact it. And I don't think this means that they failed. I think this means they succeeded because they were acting as a vanguard, not as some bureaucratic party apparatus that always does whatever they said they were going to do a week ago. They took responsibility for what needed to be done, regardless of whether that exactly lined up with what the party said at the time. And I think Zinoviev and Kamenev, two other Bolsheviks, who were always against Lenin and Trotsky in the later part of 1917 about how they should go about the revolution, they violated the dictates of the Central Committee over and over and over again. It's almost unbelievable that they were still members. But they were. And even when they were kicked out of the party, they were admitted back in because I think the party recognized that they were absolutely committed to their role as the vanguard, of taking responsibility for the strategic struggle, even if that meant that they were hard to work with and didn't always go with the party line, okay? So I think this is how we distinguish between the vanguard and the party. The vanguard's adherence to the strategic logic of proletarian hegemony is the key feature of the vanguard. That's the ultimate value that the vanguard pursues. Does this advance proletarian hegemony or not? And this is a changing game constantly, very dynamic. New conjunctures require new tasks. Also about party discipline, we've been having a Andor viewing series, and some good discussions have come up. And one of them involved the question of spontaneity and consciousness on the enemy side. You know, in the ISB, which is basically the CIA in Star Wars. And you have a couple of characters here who kind of go outside the bounds of what the ISB, which is the empire's, you know, state apparatus, intelligence apparatus, says that they should do, because they're so committed to putting down rebellion, unfortunately, they're the enemies, that they're willing to go above and beyond, right, to make sure that these enemies of the empire are basically seized or killed. And so party discipline, and I think this is the lesson that we can take away for our side, has to be responsive to the energies that sustain it and that sometimes exceed its formal dictates. I invite you to come. We're still watching Andor. We do it every Sunday. We got a few more sessions left, so Sundays at 6. Okay, now, where this all becomes concrete is in the question of class alliances. Maybe I can get one volunteer again to read these quotes for us.
Every minor crisis that a country experiences discloses to us in miniature the elements, the rudiments of the battles that will inevitably take place on a large scale during a big crisis. A socialist revolution is a proletarian revolution, but its necessary form of appearance is as a people's revolution.
Awesome, thank you. So here I want to talk about a theory I have for what depression is. Some of you may have come to my class on Freud. I studied psychology. I'm interested in this kind of stuff. For me, one way to think about depression is a condition in which we cannot accept the appearance of a universal ideal in the only form it can take, which is as a particular object. This universal idea or category, let's use an example, love, right? You want love in your life, but is this weird person in front of me really the instantiation of love that I want? Or should I constantly look for somebody else that lives up to this notion of love that I have in my head? Democracy, right? Socialism, in the interests of this class, only ever takes shape in concrete reality as a particular object with definite, oftentimes stupid and utterly contingent features. And I believe the left today suffers from this kind of depression. The inability to enjoy this contradiction, this inevitable contradiction between the universal and the particular. The universal ideal and the only way it can ever show up in material reality, which is as an oftentimes surprising and disappointing object. Now in the Freud class that I taught a couple months ago, I described the dictatorship of the proletariat as taking responsibility for society's failure and enjoying it as our own failure, as our own particular symptom, I think is the way I put it. Instead of blaming society's failure on some imagined culprit or some authority and waiting for the ideal society to present itself. Wendy Brown describes the Western left in similar terms, and she uses the term melancholia. She thinks the left is suffering from melancholia in the West, or an obsession over a lost object. Her examples are the perceived potentials that existed either in 1917 or 1968. And these persist for us on the left as fantasy ideals. So one consequence, though, of obsessing about past failures or past possibilities is the tendency to then reject the conditions of the present and instead imagine a distant future in which this past posits itself again as a possibility. Vijay Prashad has spoken about this excellently before, where he says that the ultra-leftist error is looking too far into the future because the present is dispiriting and unacceptable. The rightist error, and when I say the rightist error, I mean within the left. Okay, we know what the rightist errors are. There's a lot of them. But the rightist error on the left is looking only at the present out of a lack of boldness and vision. But the Bolshevik must take up the proper position in relation to both the future and the present. Right, the question for the Bolshevik is what is to be done? We talked about this. So Lenin invites us to intervene in the world as it actually exists and in the struggles that are actually unfolding and to actively change their course. And these are not always going to look like proletarian struggles. If we had a proletariat that was conscious of itself, we'd be in a very different place right now. But we don't have that yet. We don't have that mass class consciousness yet. So our task is to find the way to subject the actual existing struggles, which may represent diverse interests, but which all take issue with some aspect of bourgeois society, right? We have to subject these struggles to the logic of the struggle for proletarian hegemony. Part of the vanguard's role then for Lenin is to show the working class how to lead other classes. And this is what Lenin put into practice. And in 1905, the question of class alliances presented itself when there was a democratic revolution in Russia against the Tsar. So I won't make someone read these, I'll read them. Marxism teaches the proletarian not to keep aloof from the bourgeois revolution, not to be indifferent to it, not to allow the leadership of the revolution to be assumed by the bourgeoisie, but on the contrary, to take a most energetic part in it, to fight most resolutely for consistent proletarian democratism, for the revolution to be carried to its conclusion. They have reduced Marxism to such a state of wretchedly liberal distortion that nothing exists for them, he's talking about the Mensheviks, right? Beyond the antithesis between bourgeois revolution and proletarian revolution. And even this antithesis they interpret in an utterly lifeless way. So again, this is the critique of this idea of the socialist revolution in the future, where on one side you have the proletarian army, on the other side you got the bourgeois army, and they're just going to fight it out, and that will be the beginning of socialism. That's not how Lenin saw the revolution. So the question of proletarian leadership over other classes presented itself in 1905, and this was a revolution that involved mass labor strikes, peasant revolts, and demands for democratic reforms. And there were serious spontaneous uprisings. Bloody Sunday in 1905 was a presentation of grievances to the Tsar that ended up with like 1,000 or 2,000 people getting gunned down in the streets by the Tsar's army. So these were serious times of upheaval. And how far these struggles would go depended on whether, in Lenin's words, it was possible to put a proletarian imprint on the revolution. Because either, remember, if we're Marxist, either we are going to have a bourgeois hegemonic society or a proletarian hegemonic society. And for Lenin, this meant intervening in the class struggle as it currently exists. Now, the Mensheviks, operating from this logic that the real proletarian revolution is still up ahead, sometime in the future, called for ultra-radical demands at the time. So when it came to the peasants, the Mensheviks wanted to just socialize all the land in the countryside. I think a correlate to today might be the demand to abolish the police. Okay, that might be, controversial to critique that demand. But is that really the demand of the masses of people who do not like the way that they're treated by police today? I do not think that's the demand of the masses of people today who are horrified by things like George Floyd's murder. But for the Mensheviks, their approach is, look, we need to imagine this future society. We're getting there. History will push us there, right? History will, the capitalist forces of production, the antagonisms in capitalism will push us to a point of crisis. But the Bolsheviks rejected this view. We'll let those guys express themselves real quick. Get back to the class. The Bolsheviks rejected this view and instead took up what the peasants themselves were actually demanding. Full economic rights over their own plots of land. So that sounds kind of bourgeois, right? To give each peasant their own little plot of land that they can buy and sell. That sounds like a bourgeois demand, but that was the demand the peasants who were against the Tsar actually had. And this, of course, would also mean breaking up the large estates of the nobility who dominated ownership over the land in the countryside. Incidentally, even after 1905, in 1917, when the Bolsheviks were already in state power and they were exclusively running the government after the insurrection in October, the Bolsheviks still took up the peasant platform, the peasant program of one of the other socialist organizations, the Socialist Revolutionaries, which had this same individual plots of land for the peasants, was that platform. And someone pointed this out to Lenin, dude, we took state power, we're still floating this bourgeois peasant demand. And his reply to the critics was, so be it. As a democratic government, we cannot ignore the feelings of the masses even if we don't agree with them. I think this is a very, very different Lenin from the one that people imagine. This is a Lenin who is sensitive to the actual moods of the masses of people and was sensitive to what is politically possible in the process of trying to do the impossible, right? So essentially the Bolsheviks took the peasants seriously as a distinct class with distinct interests that were in conflict with the Tsarist state. And this was the concrete struggle to be won in the conjuncture they faced. And Lenin saw the possibility of proletarian hegemony through the construction of a worker-peasant alliance against the Tsar and against the hegemony of the compromising liberal so-called revolutionaries that were threatening to lead the democratic revolution in a bourgeois path. But Lenin's idea was, no, we can lead this revolution in a more revolutionary path. And the slogan that he furnished for this struggle was the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. Probably couldn't get away with that slogan today. But that was kind of the compromise, right, from the Marxist perspective. We're not just talking about a working class government, we're talking about a class alliance with people that are against the Tsar. This is the government we're trying to create. And this was not just some reframing of like, what is a proletarian? No, they thought the peasants were a separate class with separate class interests, but that had the common interest of overthrowing the Tsar. And part of the theorizing of this process was the idea of the drawing power of the vanguard, the drawing power of the vanguard to bring other classes into its political project. This is leadership. This is how the proletariat learns about its capacity to lead, is by making alliances with other classes and fighting for state power. And Lenin isn't just making this up as he goes along. This was already in Marx. This is a long-ass quote. Shit, I don't know if I even want to read it, but the basic idea is that Marx already thought of this alliance between the workers and the peasants. And he thought it was relevant in the context of the Paris Commune in 1871, and even before that, actually, in Prussia. He imagined that an alliance between the workers and peasants could be very powerful because they had common interests. So Lenin, was taking a lot of ideas that we think of as heretical directly from Marx. And a friend of mine recently said, Marx really was a Leninist. If you look back at what Marx actually said and wrote, and Lenin did, he looked at all of Marx's letters, because a lot of what Marx wrote was about political economy. But in his letters, Marx has a lot to say about politics. So the question of socialism turns on whether the proletariat is hegemonic in the social struggles of the day. And Menshevism saw hegemony only as taking place in the socialist phase of the revolution, whereas Bolshevism insists on proletarian hegemony today over the most pressing political struggles currently unfolding. So the question for Lenin in every conjuncture is, which class will lead the next instantiation of the class struggle, the bourgeoisie or the proletariat? That is the question. Who will lead the next struggle? Which class will lead it? Every site of struggle contains potentialities that favor continued bourgeois rule and potentialities that threaten bourgeois rule and suggest the prospect of proletarian power. Also in the Andor discussions, an interesting thing was brought up about the development of countries in the global south as potentially taking two paths. We can see this today. The key question for the global south is the question of development. It's not a question of, the working class taking over the government right now. That's not the key question. The key question is development. How are we literally going to triple our power supply in our country? Questions like this. And there are two paths that these countries can take. This is very crude. There's a lot of different, countries involved in the way that countries developed. But if we put it in this crude, simplistic way, you can take out a loan from the IMF that has political strings attached, And you can gamble that this loan by itself will get your country to the point where it's more productive and that it can provide more for its people. But on the back end, you're going to have to sell a lot of the political power of that government away to foreign capital, right? And this is the way that countries have been forced into developing under US hegemony. But China has put forward another path of development. Like it or not, it is another path of development that countries can take. And it is not a path of predatory loans. A lot of these loans have been forgiven. It is a path, it's also not charity, right? China is getting something out of these. It's getting raw materials out of these deals. But it is teaching countries how to build their own infrastructure. It's training people how to do these things, build dams, build, trains. And teaching countries how to build things like electric cars. I think this is an example from Bolivia in the partnership that China and Bolivia had. This is proposing a concrete path that opposes the bourgeois hegemony of the United States path. It's giving countries another way to develop. And I think this is a very Leninist gesture, even though it's fraught with all sorts of problems that we could talk about. This is a Leninist gesture. Is this going to happen one way or the other? Right now, in the current conjuncture. I think this is the Leninist insight that we need to take away from his project. Another way of defining the class struggle, then, is as a struggle over seemingly secondary and tertiary battles for which class will lead them. A process never taking the form of the pure opposition of proletarian versus bourgeoisie. Even though theoretically, this is how I introduced the class, right? It was this pure opposition of capital and labor. But in practice, that's never how politics works. And that's why it's so hard to come to consciousness, because society does not look like this black and white antagonism between capital and labor. Society looks like an alliance of classes that seem to all be participating in the way society works. It involves the subjugation of a variety of classes that seem to consent to the existing state of affairs. And this is part of how bourgeois hegemony consolidates itself, is by disguising the class nature of bourgeois society. Yeah.
Could you talk a bit more about what, I'm still confused about like the role of the peasantry and how, like what their vibe would be in the proletarian revolution. Like would they like, yeah, I guess I just don't get their, it's like a secret third thing that's confusing me.
Maybe someone else from the audience can try to answer that. I'm kind of tired of talking. Yeah, please.
Lenin saw the peasantry as just a sizable force, and because of the class structure within peasant society, the fact they had kulaks, you had middle peasants, you had big peasants, right? That the class struggle wasn't only exclusive to the proletariat. The Mensheviks believed that the class struggle and the revolutionary potential only existed in the proletariat, and Lenin, due to thinking that the proletariat's very small relative to the peasantry, he viewed that the peasantry had to have revolutionary potential. There's a work by him called The Development of Capitalism in Russia that's really good, that goes over a lot of how the peasantry form and why he thinks that it is a revolutionary sort of reserve in Tsarist Russia.
We have another question over here too.
Wait, okay, it's actually not a question. It's more of like a comment on the China thing. Is that okay? Okay, I think that the saying China is giving an alternative path to development that is very Lenin would have approved of is quite controversial, considering the fact that they're handing over extremely surveillancing technology to many fascist, mostly fascist states. And so giving that technology that would end up giving a lot of people who are working in the rebellion, putting them in jail while not actually addressing the structural issues is just arming fascism, and also giving like this like simplistic like pro-China like thing is like a little bit kind of like patronizing, because it's saying like, oh, like anything like anti like the Western capitalist sense is like good, when in reality like we should still be just as like critical in holding like other, I think, forms like to the same weight kind of. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but
I knew I shouldn't have brought up China. Here is where I actually do want to give some credit to the Menshevik perspective. Because the Menshevik perspective, even though it gives too much weight to it, appreciates a particular aspect of Marxism that is important, which is that the development of the forces of production actually matters. It actually matters. It creates conditions of its own accord that we can then intervene in, and make revolutionary gestures in. But without development, without abundance in the economy, we can't really have a convincing, successful socialist project, at least on an international scale. And so I think, I'm not going to get into all the details of the way that China builds its foreign policy, but I will say this. I think that what their gamble is that by developing the forces of production in different countries that are currently not really sovereign, that don't have independence from US hegemony, it creates the conditions where a political project could actually succeed in those countries. Right now, the political projects that China is supposedly subverting by selling surveillance technology are not successful. They're not successful. And the reason is partly because of the conditions of these countries. And so this is where I think kind of the orthodox Marxist perspective is actually kind of needed again. Now, I'm sure that doesn't settle the problem, but that's as much as I think I'll say on it right now. All right, I do appreciate the comments. Gives me a break, and it's also, I think it's a conversation certainly worth having in more depth, and we should be critical, I think, of the way that even countries that we would think of as allies behave. I think that's fine. But what I'm trying to say is, to get back to this idea of the universal idea having to take a concrete character, I think that is the point that I'm insisting on here. And that is never going to be pretty. The next topic I actually want to address is imperialism. Lenin has a theory of imperialism. It was one of, it was brought up in the preliminary group discussion as one of the things he contributed theoretically. But again, here I'm gonna continue this thread, right? This thread of Lenin as the necessity of intervening in the complexity of the moment now, without prolonging and postponing the socialist struggle to some future date. So a good deal of what mattered to Lenin, this is from Alan Chandro, in characterizing imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism was the impossibility of assuming that the complex alignment of social forces in the bourgeois democratic revolution and under imperialism would ever evolve into a simple polarization of capital and labor. So Lenin's sensitivity to the complexity of classes and social strata under capitalism, which the vanguard has to navigate strategically, this was actually carried forward by Frantz Fanon in his analysis of colonized societies. And in his most Leninist chapter of Wretched to the Earth, this Spontaneity, its Strength and Weakness, Fanon describes the critical moment of the anti-colonial struggles in Africa as the formation of an alliance between the failed revolutionaries of the cities, the intelligentsia who were unable to successfully get a revolution started there, an anti-colonial revolution. They intermixed with the rural population who already held a deep resentment for the colonial regime and were becoming impatient with the urban population that seemed to be dragging its heels. And so Fanon has advice for these revolutionaries who find themselves now cast out of the cities and among the peasants. The political educator ought to lead the peasants to understand that certain fractions of the population have particular interests and that these do not always coincide with the national anti-colonial interest. The people will thus come to understand that the national independence sheds light on many facts which are sometimes divergent and antagonistic. Such a taking stock of the situation at this precise moment of the struggle is decisive, for it allows the people to pass from total indiscriminating nationalism to social and economic awareness. And so in order for, you might think of the colonial situation as the most black and white struggle, right? We have a colonizing nation that has set up its repressive apparatus in this country, and we have the members of that country themselves who are oppressed. But even in this, seemingly black and white situation, there's a complexity of class forces. There's always a complexity of class forces. And it is the responsibility of the conscious vanguard to assess these forces and imagine an intervention that organizes them in a way that can lead to success, that can lead to revolution. Now, the Menshevik failure to understand these kinds of insights took its most tragic form in the decision by several of the socialist parties in Europe to support their own bourgeois governments during World War I. So this is part of this consequence of only imagining this future socialist revolution and to kind of reject the conditions of the present as they stand. Just to reiterate, the Second International is who we're talking about here, and this is the consolidated national organizations, socialist parties, mostly in Europe, who were confronting a situation at the beginning of World War I where their own governments were fighting against each other. And they failed to unite the whole proletariat of the world, and they backed their individual capitalist governments. And I was just watching this movie, Dr. Zhivago, which ends up being pretty anti-communist, I think. But I'm not done with it. But there are some really good parts in it. And one of them, they present a Bolshevik perspective on the war. And I think I have it, actually. Do I? Yeah, okay, I just have this picture. So this is a screenshot from the movie, and this is when the Russian soldiers on the front lines desert and refuse to fight the war, and this is them ripping one of the officers off of his horse, who's trying to get them to continue fighting. But this is the quote. In bourgeois terms, it was a war between the Allies and Germany. In Bolshevik terms, it was a war between the Allied and German upper classes. and which of them won was a matter of indifference. It's kind of cold-blooded, but I think that does distill the Leninist perspective on World War I, which the leaders of the Second International could not come to. They did not share this perspective, and their perspective was put in a counter theory of imperialism called ultra-imperialism. This was Karl Kautsky's theory. He was one of the propagandists of the German Social Democratic Party. And just to give the broad strokes of it, he thought that imperialism was just one stage of capitalism, and then we're going to get to ultra-imperialism, where capitalist governments realize war is wasteful, it's bad for capital accumulation, and we're going to reach this peaceable stage of capitalism called ultra-imperialism, and that's when we're really going to do the socialist stuff. Is when we get there. Lenin, his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, is a response to that perspective. It's a direct attack on that perspective. And he says, imperialism is the eve of socialist revolution. And he has different reasons for why he thinks this is the case that aren't just polemical. But his point is, imperialism brings the capitalist antagonism to the farthest reaches of the planet. It creates oppressed populations that it brings into its fold that are going to be revolutionary. We need to fight for revolution now, today, under these conditions. We can't just weather the storm and hope conditions look better in the future. Now, another observation that Lenin made in this book is this complexity of classes within the imperial core, right? The labor aristocracy. We've probably heard these insights that Lenin had about capitalism's attempt to kind of bribe layers of the working classes in Europe and in the United States and try to buy them off. It's not a direct bribe, and Alan Shandro points out in his book that it's really part of the logic of strategy and hegemony that capitalism tries to turn losses into wins. So when workers demand, better conditions, better wages, capitalism grants that, but uses that to divide the working class between more privileged and less privileged sectors that we now, as anti-war people, have to navigate. So capitalism is creating complexities that we have to navigate. Imagine trying to create complexities that capitalism has to navigate. That would be when we're really entering the political arena. When the capitalists are having to figure out our gestures, our interventions, and coming up with its own strategies to deal with those. But the point of all this discussion of imperialism is just to continue this idea of the complexity of classes as being the key way that we consider the revolutionary intervention in the current moment. Okay. I do want to get to more discussion because there's a lot of people here and I really want to hear what people have to say. The last thing we're going to talk about is Lenin's theory of the state. And I'm going to try to get to what we mean by democracy, dictatorship, and the state. Now, I have a few quotes here. Maybe someone could read these for us real quick.
It is only through active experimentation in the dictatorship of the proletariat that the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie can be known or revealed. State power is always the political power of a single class. This power is held in an absolute way by a single class. Dictatorship is rule-based directly upon force and unrestricted by any laws.
All right, thank you. So, what do we mean by dictatorship? And I think there are two ways of thinking about terms like democracy and dictatorship. The first way is to consider them as direct forms of government, So like a self-appointed military general, right, ruling as a dictator. That's a dictatorship. And then a democracy is, an elected parliament and a president. But that's not the Marxist way of understanding these terms. The Marxist way of understanding these terms is as a description of the class composition of a given state. So whatever form a state takes, we're looking at the class power behind the state. So within the confines of the class power behind a given state, there can be different formal styles of government. So you could have a democracy or a direct dictatorship, as long as they retain the class character of the society. And the class character of the society is what mattered to Marx and Lenin. So do we have a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie or the proletariat? In other words, do these formal styles of government fall within the bounds of what is acceptable to the real ruling class, which is either the proletariat or the bourgeoisie? So even if, a dictatorship of capital has a system of laws and democratic rights, they are subordinate to the real law. So there's all these laws, right, in our society, but there's really a real law, which is no matter what, the right of capital to rule over the proletariat is going to be protected. The essence of the Marxist theory of the state for Lenin was contained in this class analysis of the state as a body that ensures continued relations of domination by one class over another. In other words, the state we could think of as the machinery that fixes in place the existing system of social relations. That's the function of the state for Marx and Lenin. But as we've learned, classes only exist in relation to other classes, and class power is always veiled through a system of class alliances and the consent of the various dominated classes, intermediate classes even. And it's not least of all veiled through the bourgeois form of democracy. And Lenin was sensitive to these subtleties in his political practice, despite his polemical treatment of the theory of the state as ruled by a single class over another. And this is where I think, people make mistakes in interpreting Lenin, because in theoretical terms, he's very clear. Either the state is bourgeois or it is proletarian. But in his political practice, he's sensitive to all these complexities that we've been talking about in the way that society shows up, in the way that bourgeois society conceals the class power of its government. Now, what is the dictatorship of the proletariat? A dictatorship of the proletariat means that the working class political project decisively subverts the capitalist political project and impresses its influence over all of society. Now again, I don't think this will always look like the rule of a single class. And this is, again, why coming to consciousness is so complicated. A class dictatorship is only the leadership by one class over all the other classes in society, who more or less consent to its values, its norms, its laws, etc. And so that's what a proletarian dictatorship will look like. This is what Lenin meant by the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. It's going to be a class alliance that follows the path of the proletariat, but that takes on this, rich, complex character. Now, I'm thinking back to the Cold War caricature. If it's all class rule, what's the difference, right? Why are we fighting for one or the other? A comrade the other day with the Peace and Freedom Party put this really nicely. And he explained the difference, effectively, between the capitalists and the workers in terms of the way that they lead. And what he said is that while the capitalists find different ways of lying to the different classes and social layers of society, the workers find different ways of telling them the truth. While the leadership of the capitalists only serves to reinforce capital accumulation, exploitation, and wars for the conquest of markets and resources, which you of course have to lie about to everybody, that's your project, the leadership of the proletariat serves to abolish class oppression and war in general. Now, the reason we adhere to the term dictatorship of the proletariat is because socialism is more our project than formal democracy is. This is kind of a tough pill to swallow if you're just coming around to the ideas of Marxism. Socialism is our project. Democracy is not our project. Lenin talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat as presenting a new form of both democracy and dictatorship. It's democratic in a new way, and it's dictatorial in a new way. Because democracy for who, right? That was a question Lenin was famous for asking. If you say you're living in a democracy, who is it democratic for? Who has access to this democracy? And who is it oppressing, right? And so this is one of the ways, we talked about bourgeois hegemony. I think this is one of the ways that the bourgeoisie effectively subverts challenges to its power is by hiding behind ideal terms like democracy, idealist terms like democracy, concealing the actual power that their so-called democracy is about. So I think for us, we ultimately have to choose between a bourgeois dictatorship veiled as a democracy or the dictatorship of the proletariat in whatever form it comes. And that's not always going to be, freedom of speech for everybody. Everybody gets to go to the polls and elect whoever comes, shows up for the elections. Lenin, right after the October Revolution, shut down a lot of the bourgeois newspapers. He put them out of business. Why? Well, before the October Revolution, the provisional government shut down the Bolshevik papers, right? Because these are political weapons, right? They are the weapons of a particular class. And if you're in an irreconcilable conflict with a particular class, nothing is off the table when it comes to the strategic logic of hegemony. And so that's why Lenin and Marx insist on this kind of ugly terminology of dictatorship, the dictatorship of the proletariat. And the contingent necessities of the strategic logic of hegemony will largely determine the particular form that something like the dictatorship of the proletariat takes. So the particular conditions of a society, the conditions of the way that our enemy is organizing, will determine the way that a revolutionary government looks. Now I just want to contrast the Bolshevik understanding with the Menshevik understanding of proletarian power, and then I want to just open it up to a discussion. So for the Mensheviks, I'm going to try to just shorten what I was going to say a little bit. For the Mensheviks, and particularly for Kautsky in the German Social Democratic Party, he believed in the dictatorship of the proletariat, but he insisted on this democratic form, right? He fell into this bourgeois thinking that if we just get a majority in the parliament, then the bourgeoisie will have to recognize that a majority is on our side and they'll have to submit, basically. And then we can start passing all the reforms that we need to pass to make our class the hegemonic class. But what he misses is this strategic logic of hegemony, that we're involved in an irreconcilable struggle that does not follow rules, and that will have to involve, and this came up at the beginning of the class, some of the groups talked about this, a period of unprecedentedly violent class struggle in Lenin's terms. This is the inevitable point of maturity of the conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And during this period, the state must inevitably be a state that is, again, democratic in a new way and dictatorial in a new way. Okay, I think I want to leave it there. I had some, it's heretical not to talk about the Soviets themselves, but I'm going to skip that part. Because I do want to have a discussion. I think we'll go to like 9:15 since we got a late start. And I want to first kind of cover what we just talked about and then open it up to a discussion. So what then is Leninism? Well, Marxism, because remember, Lenin is a Marxist, is the recognition of the primacy and irreconcilability of the capital-labor antagonism in bourgeois society and its necessary negation via the dictatorship of the proletariat. Okay, so that's Marxism. Socialism is the construction of the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's not the way that Bernie Sanders talked about socialism, by the way. And maybe he shouldn't have. Leninism is the recognition that this can only mean the hegemony of the proletariat at the expense of the bourgeoisie over the existing struggles of the day, not the far-off socialist revolution. Meaning socialism in practice will, as Marx said, always take the form of a people's revolution. The struggle for socialism will therefore traverse every class, social layer, and aspect of society, not just the capital-labor relation. And the resulting hegemonic struggle will contest bourgeois state power, inviting a response from the bourgeoisie, producing a new and unforeseen sequence of class struggle requiring its own unique formulations and strategic orientations to further advance the project of proletarian hegemony. And the vanguard is the class-conscious element, which will draw into its ranks Marxists from every milieu of society, from every class, responsible for shouldering the strategic burden of the project for workers' power. Okay, so that's the best I could do to summarize what Leninism means for me, and for Alan Shanjo, I think. I'm being faithful to his reading of Lenin. Okay, now, to put this in practice, yeah. Sure. Yeah, so I would say Marxism basically says that the relationship between owners of capitalist property, like factories, the banks, we have such a financialized capitalism now. Big like agrarian properties, right, where food is grown. Owners of this kind of property and the people that work on their property and that help them make money by extracting value from the value produced by their workers, that's not just one aspect of society. That's not just one thing that happens in society. That is the key thing that happens in society. And that changes the way the rest of society looks. The way that we reproduce ourselves, the way that, we produce the things that we need. The way that we do that involves a particular kind of relationship. And between the boss and the worker, that is the way it shows up under capitalism. That's the way that colors the relationships in the rest of society, basically. So that's fundamental. That's not just some, thing that you can discard as just part of what we're doing here. And the way to get rid of that is to cut to the heart of the problem, which is the capital-labor contradiction, antagonism, by taking state power away from the bosses, right, and giving it to the workers in a complex class alliance that will have to be determined in the conjuncture that we're analyzing, right, and acting as political subjects. So I don't know if that wasn't that simple. I mean, it's not simple, right? Consciousness is difficult. That's why we're trying to do these kinds of classes. But I want to invite you all to, engage in a discussion about these questions. So, let's take a place like LA, right? What sort of intervention in the movements in LA could meaningfully develop the hegemony of the proletariat? And I'll just throw the second one out there, just in case people want to talk about this too. What about the elections? What might be a Bolshevik approach to utilizing elections as an arena for this struggle for hegemony within the social movements? Because Lenin had a lot to say about elections, which I didn't get to cover in the lecture. Okay, but I want to invite the class to basically weigh in on these things, and maybe you can go around to whoever raises their hand. Thank you.
Does anyone want to take a stab at these?
Maybe one example for like the first question, like a type of intervention might be like instances where there's like demonstrated sort of like tenants taking control of like you know, their living conditions or like the property that they're living in. That's one.
Obviously, a big one would be like community control of the police, right? Like, I feel like most people in LA want a more accountable police force that isn't getting billions of dollars. But we have to be honest that we have a major socialist organization in LA that has elected members in city council that have voted to increase that police budget. So as Marxists, as communists, we have to organize that intervention on that movement. We can even argue like Black Lives Matter to a degree is not really fulfilling that obligation of that movement. So it is on sort of the class conscious workers to propel that movement forward. You can even argue maybe labor needs to increase. We have a big issue with the upcoming Olympics, and we know like Unite Here Local 11 has been organizing for a very long time for that upcoming event. To give it a more class character, we could argue that we could use it as a way to get housing rights. That was a big thing that happened, I forget, like in the 1990s, 1992 LA Olympics, was that we got public housing in that struggle. We need public housing in LA desperately. So that type of intervention would be absolutely necessary. Yeah, that'd be it for now.
Can I take a stab? So I was thinking recently with the terrible loss of the healthcare CEO, it did unite the masses. We saw left, right, center. Everyone kind of came together to be like, you know what? I don't care that this motherfucker died. Like, good. And that's something that I feel like, yeah, exactly. And most everyone can agree on that in some way. Healthcare is something that like really affects us all, and if it doesn't, we're waiting for that to affect us. And so it's sort of an interesting thing because we struggle with this conversation with an All Power. We have our free clinic, the All Power Free Clinic, that goes out and serves unhoused people. And we have a clinic here on Saturdays that anyone can attend. But at the same time, the Leninist approach to that wouldn't just be putting a Band-Aid and offering services to kind of fill this gap that the healthcare system has created. So we're constantly struggling through these questions of like, what is the difference between intervening? What's the difference between, I don't know, applying aid or offering aid in lieu of the for-profit healthcare system? And the answer would be, they're so cute. The answer would be to like organize more healthcare workers, raise the consciousness level up of these people who are incredibly exploited themselves, to withhold labor or do some sort of intervention that develops this ideology. But yeah, that's so cute. That's just one I thought about. Yeah, we're figuring it out. It's so good. That's the best interruption ever, honestly. Oh, yes, we got one here.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Corey. That was really, really in-depth. Brought up a lot of good stuff. I think there's like two levels that we can think about this, and one is just like, where can I get involved and where can I be active in, and that's meaningful, right? That's just like, can I get part of the anti-war movement, the Palestinian solidarity movement, the anti-genocide movement? Can I get involved with the tenant organizing, or get involved with some organizing and unionizing? I think there's a lot of opportunities for that in LA right now, just how even the service sector organizing is going and Amazon's going. So I think all of those are really valuable, and that's like something all of us, we should be seeking ways to engage with the actual class struggle. And then I think there's a second level, which is what do the the leaders of these movements do, and the leaders of these organizations do, and how can we think about our broader project for hegemony, right? Proletarian hegemony. And I think the second one is really interesting, and I think it's a difficult one. Like, I don't think we even have the discourse around it within the left of like, how can we unite the leaders in some way, the organizations in some way to move forward? And it doesn't mean like tomorrow, hey, here's a new organization where we build, but where's the collaboration and the discussion happening at across levels from like LA Tenants Union, PYM, radical union caucuses, leftist organizations? How are we building like something more strategic so we're not stuck at, get involved in movements, and that's kind of bowing to that spontaneity. It's absolutely essential that we're part of them. Like, you can't even talk about like what's hegemony or if we're not part of the movements, but we also can't talk about it if we're not building strategic organization and strategic class struggle organizing and all that kind of stuff. So, yes.
Recently, the Phillips 66 refinery was announced that it was going to be closed, and this is going to lead to the loss of, I think, around 20,000 jobs in oil refinery. There is an ongoing discussion of what's going to happen with this transition of workers. Are we prepared for the loss of those jobs? In the environmental justice movement, you want to make sure that we're breathing healthy air and we have a clean planet. So right now we need to consider, how do we take advantage of this new transition that we're going to be approaching in Los Angeles when it comes to this actual transition of power and energy sources, taking advantage of the actual momentum that we're gaining in Los Angeles to transition away from this unsustainable form of development. So taking those actions into consideration, like a real local context, is something that we can think of right now.
I think given the rather sudden change in the conditions that we are going to be experiencing given the past election and the Trump administration coming into effect, that calls on us to do exactly what you've been telling us all evening, is to figure out what the strategies are that fit the conditions. And I think something that is more important than ever in that situation right now is that you need for all of the different movements to have each other's back and to put some, find some organizational mechanism, certainly traditionally the concept of a united front, where people agree about certain things that we want to do to fight this coming oppression, and get people basically in a clearinghouse umbrella organization that takes that on, stands up to the right-wingers when they are counter-protesting or protesting, as we're going to see more of, and also just in terms of a lot of other struggles. I think in the electoral arena, something that we've been encouraging people to start thinking about in the Freedom Socialist Party is the concept of a labor party. Actually, given the what disastrous debacle of this last election, people are really ready to have an alternative, and the alternative is not Trump, but the alternative is something that is being able to be organized on the basis of our class from the bottom up. And it's a big undertaking. It's going to take a lot of rank and file caucuses all over the unions, because the unions have to be part of this if it's going to work. But those kinds of structures that give us a means to have unity among these groups is what we really need right now.
Wow, that was pretty loud. I think that I forget how the quote goes exactly, but it's something like, for Lenin, he says power doesn't just start with hundreds of people or thousands of people; it really starts with millions of people, right? And I think that Leninism, ultimately, in some sense, I think is really about scale. It's about scaling up our efforts, because we can defeat a boss like in one local setting, right? And we can even, some people, we can even form a little commune, right, together. We can even live communism together. But Leninism, in its concern with state power, is about scale, right? How do we assemble all these different disparate social forces in a system of alliances, right? Which is which is what you were talking about, Kolia. How do we assemble it so that we can, scale our effort to that size? And so I think the question for the Leninists constantly in our conjuncture here in LA is one, how do we scale up? How do we scale up our operations? And that somebody or a couple people were mentioning unity, more links between the organizations and coming together. And the thing, so, Nicola, in your presentation, you were talking about the strategic hegemony, right? And so then we have to be able to intervene in conversations like the comrade over here mentioned public housing, right? So like all these different contradictions that people were mentioning, housing, the workers, etc. We have to be able to propose something to that can animate the popular conscience of people, right? So then we need strategic direction from leadership that is ideally more and more united, so we're scaling up, right? But we also, as you mentioned with your examples on the peasantry, Kolia, we need the social force behind these strategic initiatives. It does no good to flyer about public housing just randomly, right? We can have all the right ideas and right projects of what would be meaningful to do right now, but we need the social force, the organized social force. So we need unions, we need, all sorts of bodies and organs of worker power, of worker organization. We need that we need to bring the working class up to a certain scale that, they can communicate a popular message to more and more people. And that includes elections, but one of the tricky things about elections that people are always squeamish about is like, that's so lame. Like, I mean, we're trying to win power, perhaps even violently, and we're checking boxes on the ballot. Like, what the fuck? Or we're flying. Just it feels a little lame. But it gets the message out to a broader, strata of people, just the broadest possible layer of people. But I do think there's some justification for people's squeamishness, is that to run successful, meaningful election campaigns, we need social forces moving alongside our campaigns, increasing in size. So we need more organized masses, and we need strategic direction.
Hi again, my name is Ten. I want to talk about elections a little bit because I live with like Marxist Leninist cadre, and like I would just think about like, well, why don't we endorse like PSL? Because they're basically running a working class platform, which is necessary because elections are like a opportunity to develop like political education basically. And I think like, yeah, everything they say, yeah, we agree with. But even as I would like we travel the country and talk to different people about PSL, they have all these criticisms. I'm like, okay, cool, yeah, like, have your criticisms, but like at the end of the day, we're on the same mass line. Like PSL is on that mass line with us, and so if we can just like throw in a vote for them, sure. Because to be honest with you, they like all the third parties. Well, out of all the third parties, RFK I think was like the most popular. So like the leftist third parties aren't even like making that much of a dent. And sometimes, and one of my other comrades was saying that what might be scary is that I think there's one issue of not being able to communicate things to people in an accessible way, because most Americans read at like a 6th grade level, and so the ways that we even talk like during this discussion, for someone like even me, it's like very hard to understand sometimes. And so I think being able to make things accessible, which I think is kind of funny as like you're developing a working class theory that isn't accessible to working class people. Like, but Marx is a scientist, so that was just his role. But then also, the second one, what was the second one? I lost it. Oh, that people maybe also do understand what we're trying to say, and then they're just not resonating with it. And I think that might be scary if people are like hearing what like communism is about, or we're trying to communicate these things, and they don't resonate with it. Then what do you do? Because it's not just about accessibility. It's like, well, people aren't even, So I think we have to think about this material conditioning culture and all this stuff more. Yeah. Anyways, that's that.
Yeah, I was gonna bring this back to the elections, like you brought up, like why don't we endorse PSL? Well, you should be endorsing PSL. Lenin himself, like when he wrote a letter to the British workers, he encouraged them to vote for for the Labour Party, and he also said like you should support the Labour Party the way a noose supports a hangman. Like basically, your job is to like basically this phrase gets overused a lot. Expose them, like expose them that they're not really there for the working class. It's like the Labour Party itself. Like they said that the oligarchy will be assured that the imperial core will be safe in the hands of the Labour Party. Basically, social democracy was going to be the arm of the imperialists back then when England was England was the main empire before the U.S. took over. But also like you start pushing like the other comrade said it brings like the working class is usually just focused on politics every 4 years because they're usually busy, and the only time they're accustomed to politics is every 4 years, or so. Y'all agree? Yeah, cool. Yeah. So the work of the vanguard, which is the vanguard, is it wasn't just like advanced Marxists. It was already organized Marxists. They already had their own groups. So Lenin was the organizer of the organizers. So you gotta like point that out. You can't just say like, oh, the vanguard. A lot of people don't really understand what the vanguard is. They'll think it's just a small group of Marxists that understand and read, and they're like they know what to do. But like no, it's already people that already knew what they were doing, and they were being guided to lead the revolution. Also, you gotta like we're covering with imperialism. I'm trying to break a lot of things up. With imperialism, it's monopoly capitalism. It's bankers when they break up the world sections of the world so they could benefit so they could have their own benefits. Oh shit. Also, like going back to like the beginning where I came in, the question is like one of the things that Lenin developed that Marx oversaw is like Marx believed that the revolution was going to come from the West. It's like because it was the most advanced, developed, and Lenin he saw the conditions that was going on, and he was like, no, the revolution is going to come from the oppressed countries. So that's like one of the main differences, like why we call ourselves Leninists instead of just Marxist, because most of the Marxists they're like the West is the best. It's like we're gonna be the ones that bring up the revolution. That's why the 1914 tragedy happened, where the Second International backstabbed the workers and sent 20 million to their debt. But like I'm about to close my point. Elections, like so we should bring up like the bring up like the points of the working class, like not just public housing. It should be like expropriate all private property, all private apartments, make them into like not just public housing, but like for make sure everybody has one home before anyone could have two, and like just certain things like it might not seem extreme to us, but to the working class, well, to the class conscious working class, they will be you could bring up like will seem extreme to them. Will just be some basic things like universal health care in most of the Western countries. It's something that it's a fact. It's like something that they already have. In the U.S., universal health care seems like. Go ahead. Yeah, I understand. That's why they want to talk about.
Also, quick note on elections, it's so funny that Americans have this like idea of perfection. We watch Marvel movies without any critique, really, and then we'll be like, oh, but that political party said this one thing, so I'm just not going to support it. I'm like, you hold socialists to a standard you don't even hold capitalists to. But anyways, I think you were next.
I was going to say this answer, but Cole kind of fucked it up, but I was going to just say we got to be more like China, but I guess I'll elaborate that simple answer. But I think we need to. I think the topic that I heard coming up a lot is building alliances and building like with other groups, especially in a city like LA. But I think we do need like a stronghold of leadership, because I think there's like this ultra leftist horizontalist idea that like we're not leaders, like there's no such thing like, there is people that are good at leadership, and I think we got to own that. And then We got to have a group of people that agree on that basis of leadership to lead a movement against ideas that, like ultra leftist views that kind of take away a lot, which is like that a lot of people are like, oh, I don't work with those people because they're that and that, like because they're problematic or there's something that we disagree on. When like we got to realize that the world that we kind of want to build doesn't exist, and everybody we're going to encounter is going to behave in a way that we don't agree with, that's in some way shaped by the system that we grew up in, and then their ideas and everything was shaped by that. And I think we got to have a leadership that understands that and functions around the working class to build a working class movement in LA around those things. And I feel like that's the biggest fail in LA, that this faction, like they're like, for example, like I don't work with PSL, blah blah blah, they're problematic, right? Like, and then like they'll turn around and work with Unisys or some other stuff or some other people, right? So there's people have their preferences, that they have their things that are going on. So, and that's shaped a lot by the hegemony of capitalism and the society we live in. So we do have to have a confident leadership that's confident in knowing what we want and the things that are correct for the working class, and drive that in. And I feel like we don't see that a lot. People always like timid, like, oh, I don't know shit, I'm just like here on the, but in reality we're doing a lot of shit that makes a lot of decisions and sometimes makes things worse even with the best intentions. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
And I'm so sorry, guys. I think we're pretty low on time. Otherwise, I would grab everyone else. But
Yeah, I think we'll just wrap it up here. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being a part of the discussion. And what was that? yeah, we'll have a pitch for sure.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you guys so much for coming. That was an incredible class. Thank you so much, Kolya. I will say though, I don't think my brain is big enough. That did not feel 101 to me. I was like, what? But fantastic work. Thank you so much. We are a completely volunteer-run communist bookstore. And it's funny enough, we don't say it often, but we consider ourselves Marxist-Leninists because we believe in the science of Marxism, but we also want to get shit done. And that is one of these like steps that we have to take day by day. The struggle is daily, constant, and unforgiving. So if you support our work, please help us keep the space open so that we can build these coalitions with Law2 and PFP and the PSL and CPUSA and all these different organizations that are trying to make Los Angeles a better place for everyone. So if you could support us, we have some t-shirts on sale. We've got our books, merch. We've got some free literature over here and over here. We rely completely on donations and the sale of our merch. We don't keep a single penny of profit. So please support us. Please donate online. And if you'd like to volunteer, we have a little volunteer form at the front. Yes, we've got Venmo for other monetary donations. And since we are volunteer run, I'm so sorry, if you could fold up your chairs, and then we have a little space under the stairs. But what were you going to say?
Yeah, as a good Leninist, sometimes you have to mislead the masses into thinking they're coming to a 101 class when it's actually a 304 class. Thanks for coming.